In this episode, we're going to be diving into the evolving research and insights on psychological safety and what we're currently learning. Now, as I quickly share some housekeeping notes, drop in the chat or the comments box on social and let us know where you're joining in from today. We are recording today's session, so if you're interested in a replay, be on the lookout for an email later today. That email is going to include a survey for feedback, as well as a number of resources that are aligned to today's conversation. We also suggest putting your phone on Do Not Disturb, quitting out of your email and messaging apps so you can really get the most out of today's discussion. And it's also going to help with your audio and video quality. And lastly, we love interaction, so feel free to share your thoughts and comments with us in the chat. Now, to get this show underway, I'm going to introduce our guest for today. Our guest for today is a researcher at the Neuroleadership Institute, where she helps clients achieve goals through targeted research and measurement design. Prior to joining NLI, she applied inclusion research to develop leader tools to improve military force readiness. She holds a Master of Public Health and a PhD in Community Psychology. A warm welcome to the Impact and Measurement Designer at NLI, Dr. Bridget Lin. Thanks for being here today, Bridget.
Thank you so much, Shelby. I'm excited to be here.
Wonderful. And our moderator for today is a director of research at the Neuroleadership Institute, where she focuses on translating cognitive and social neuroscience into actionable solutions for organizations, as well as helps communicate relevant research in an accessible manner for the public. Previously, she was a professor at Dominican College and New York University and a researcher at the Nathan Klein Institute. She holds a bachelor's degree from Brown University and a PhD in neuroscience from New York University. A warm welcome to the Director of Research at NLI, Dr. Emma Sorrow. Emma, it's great to have you here today, and I will pass it over to you.
Thank you, Shelby. Hi, everyone. I am so excited to be here with Bridget. I think this is my first Y-Ball with my teammate Bridget, and it's going to be a great one. So today I'm just going to kind of tee us up, and then I'll pass it over to her to kind of take it away. But this is our first in kind of a mini series on the ideas around psychological safety, what we've been learning about, what we understand, what's next kind of on our pipeline. It's been a long journey, and we'll cover some of our key insights along the way. So today we're really going to be focusing on what psychological safety is, the underlying neuroscience, what we're seeing in our kind of first steps as we work with clients in building psychological safety. Next Friday, we're going to talk a bit about how the idea of accountability is kind of coming up and what we understand about that, because these two constructs are things that people are really interested in trying to understand. And then the following week, we do have a special episode where Dr. David Rock, and Dr. Amy Edmondson are going to be together talking about how those two constructs come together, and the necessary and the critical nature of both of those being present at the same time. So, we're hoping to kind of start this discussion and weave in our understanding of psychological safety first. So I have to say, we are not new to thinking about the underlying science of psychological safety. As you can see here, we've been writing and thinking about this for a while, just touching on different tangential pieces of it, understanding, how different environments create a sense of threat or reward or safety or things like that in our everyday life. Just last year, we came out with an article that covered how the threat response happens in the workplace and what to do about it. And we're currently, Bridget and I both are currently working on publishing our understanding of psychological safety in our next publication. So we'll probably be back again to talk about that. So before I pass it over to Bridget to really discuss what she knows as our resident organizational psychological safety expert, I do want to kind of set the stage for what we're thinking about, what we're seeing still in the workplace. And even if you just look at the most recent reports, psychological safety is still one of the top trends, one of the top needs for our employees in the workplace. 9 out of 10 of them want their employer to value their emotional and psychological welfare and consider psychological safety as one of the most valued aspects in the workplace. So just think about that as we talk about what it is, what it looks like, and how to create it. So I'm going to turn the mic over to Bridget, and she's going to kind of describe what is psychological safety.
Thanks so much, Emma. And I'm really excited to be here with you too. We get to work together a lot on this, and it's an exciting topic. So I'm going to get started with a story and then kind of move into a specific definition of psychological safety. And so I am going to talk through what happened on March 2011. There was an earthquake off the coast of Japan, and it led to a tsunami that struck the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant. And the tsunami really, it knocked out power. It destroyed emergency generators. There was no way to cool down the reactors. And that resulted in explosions that gravely injured workers, had a huge negative impact on the surrounding environment. Many people were forced to evacuate and actually haven't been able to return because the cleanup is estimated that will take between 30 and 40 years. And after this disaster, there was an independent investigation, and it really became evident that this disaster could have been avoided. And so that kind of naturally prompts the question of, well, then if it could have been avoided, what went wrong? And in the investigation, what they saw was that there were multiple people over a number of years that really spoke up, and they spoke out about warnings. They made recommendations for safety, but ultimately they were dismissed and there was no action taken. And this was a disastrous result because of a lack of psychological safety in the safety planning process. So people were speaking up, but they weren't listened to, they weren't heard. And that really ended in this terrible disaster.
Yeah, that's horrible. And I think one of the most interesting things about this is that in the same area, responding to the same tragedy, 5 miles down the road, what happens when the environment within the workplace are different?
Yeah, and so this is one of the reasons that I think this story is so compelling. Because as you mentioned, less than 5 miles down the coast, the Daiichi plant also suffered from severe damage from the tsunami. And in this case, the employees managed to safely shut down all the reactors and ultimately avoid the explosions. And the positive results of the Daiichi plant are really credited to the superintendent of the plant, Nihiro Masudo, being able to create that environment of psychological safety. And what Masudo's leadership really is a great example of is embracing some of those key principles of psychological safety. So, for example, honesty, vulnerability, communication, and information sharing. He embraced all of these. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about how. So one of the things that he was credited for was really using the whiteboard as an amazing tool. So writing things down on a whiteboard, really issuing information rather than orders, to arm the employees with data. And this team really depended on each other's observations, on each other's ideas, on each other's concerns to do life-saving work that was really all about overcoming seemingly impossible circumstances. And so they were all very clear on the goal. The goal was save the plant. And they had to do that by really getting power to the disabled reactors. And so what's so interesting here is that there was an original plan, and that was to lay almost 5.5 miles of cable. And each piece of this cable weighed nearly a ton and took 100 employees to move. And they had 24 hours to do this. And this task would normally take a month. But this was their original plan, and they went to it. And in this, which is also interesting, is that anyone was able to refuse, because this was like you were putting your life in danger. And so the employees were working at a really superhuman pace without rest. And Masudo, into this plan, started realizing this isn't going to work. This is not going to get us the result we need. And he demonstrated his strengths as a leader and admitted that to these people that were there that were working tirelessly. He said, I made a mistake. This isn't going to work. All the work we're putting in, we have to pause. And although this news was like unwelcome, through his extreme candor and being willing to say that, what he did was he increased the chances that as a group, they could figure out how to handle the situation. And so they went back to the whiteboard. The team adjusted their plan. And when they were implementing the new plan, some engineers noticed that there was pressure building in one of the units, and it was really climbing faster than the others. And these engineers spoke up and they suggested, hey, wait, pause. We need to refocus our energy. Some new information is here. And what's equally important here and kind of, aligns with the story before is that they were heard. Masudo listened and he took their suggestions seriously. And ultimately, throughout this process, the team restored cooling function to the reactors. And the stakes were so high in the situations, the employees really were putting their life on the line. They were risking their own lives. They were working to save the lives of their community members. And it was just such high stakes. However, what is so interesting here is that the interpersonal fear among the team in the group that was solving the problem was essentially non-existent. They had psychological safety. And because of that, the team completed a seemingly impossible feat. And that's really amazing.
No, absolutely. That story kind of gives me chills. At this example is one of the highest stakes, right? And the one where, you actually see like the chances of like physical harm. And it's not always like that in the workplace. So, but we can create psychological safety in an environment that is incredibly high stakes for physical health, as well as, in the workplace where it's really just social interactions, and both of them are important. And so as we, think about these two examples as like descriptions of, like what it is when it's there and like when you lack it, what could happen. Let's just like dial it back to like, what is the academic definition of psychological safety? Some of you who know Amy Edmondson's work will know this by heart. I know Bridget probably does. So why don't we talk about that?
Sure, and you're absolutely right. This is the most common definition, which is psychological safety is a shared belief that people won't be punished or humiliated for speaking up with ideas, questions, concerns, or mistakes. And it comes from Amy Edmondson's groundbreaking research on psychological safety. And in that research, what she found was that the highest performing nursing teams also were the teams that reported the most mistakes. Now, it's really important to realize here, it didn't mean that those teams were making more mistakes. It meant that they felt okay reporting them. And in the process of reporting the mistakes, they were also able to talk about the mistakes. And when teams are able to talk about mistakes, you're able to refine processes and ultimately improve performance. So you find your mistakes, you talk about your mistakes, you refine your processes and improve your performance in this constant cycle. And that is what psychological safety really is.
Amazing. And I can see a lot of those pieces in each of the stories. And also, as I'm thinking, because we, just kind of primed everyone to the idea of accountability, I can start to see how that is a component of it, even though I won't dive into it now because we want people to show up next week. So we have this definition. Now, what does it look like if you were to describe it?
Sure. So that's a great question. And a lot of people really are like, how do you take this term psychological safety and make it real? So for me, I like to think about it is psychological safety really lives in our social context at work. It's our interpersonal work environment. Ultimately, and down to the basics, how we interact with each other. And in this, it's the observations people make about what behaviors are recognized, rewarded, and supported. And so when you're working in a team, not only are you receiving information and feedback based on your actions, but you're observing people and seeing how others are reacting to them when they're engaging in a behavior. And so it really starts to lead to you drawing a conclusion about how things are around here. How do things work? If I want to succeed, what do I see happening? And by thinking about psychological safety as this interpersonal work environment and this climate, that social context piece, we're able to really start to consider the social reality of the work environment and understand that this isn't about one individual. The onus can't be solely on one individual. You really have to actively avoid the thought of, well, that person should have just said something. That person should have just spoke up, because it doesn't take into consideration all those important factors that influence our behavior of whether or not we speak up, such as our inherent biases, power dynamics, organizational reward systems. Another piece of this is psychological safety is dynamic. It's situational. It's going to be different based on different contexts. So it'll look different when you're on an innovation team versus a finance team. It'll look different when the same team is implementing different phases of a project. Like if you're implementing kind of a planning phase versus execution. And really what's important to take away here is the conditions and the kind of constraints that people are under influence how they interact together. And finally, psychological safety is most notable and important at the team level. And this means that really intervening at the team level holds the greatest potential to increase psychological safety. So really remembering it's not a thing a single person can do, nor is it something a really big group can do. It's really a level where people are actually coming together and interacting. They're learning from one another. They are in it together. And that's how you get to the high quality work.
Amazing. So I guess the next question, if you go on to the next page.
Yeah. So even like, when we're thinking about psychological safety and coming together to do high quality work, what we realize is that this is actually kind of hard. And why is it so hard? And we get asked that a lot. And so I'll hand it over to you. Like, why doesn't this even come naturally to us?
Yeah. And why we have to teach people how to do it. I mean, it's not something that, given how, we see all the benefits, obviously this is something that'll help everyone work better together. But, we talk about this a lot at Align. Anyone who follows us, if you were to go on to the next slide, for anyone who follows our work, we do talk a lot about like the underlying basis for what drives our behavior. One of the major things that drives our behavior is our reaction to what is potentially a threat and what is potentially a reward, or what is potentially something safe. And that's a kind of a distinction that here comes into play. But what one of the most important driving factors for us is how sensitive we are to potential threats in our environment. And we've covered this many times. There's a whole network in our brain that is incredibly sensitive to our surroundings, and it leads to all sorts of behaviors. And these behaviors that are specifically important here are when we do sense an experienced threat for ourselves, we display decreases in things like how curious we are, our ability to reason, our ability to share information and show pro-social behavior. These things are really important for what we see in situations of lacking psychological safety, and also making decisions that are more biased or more defensive. So all of these things are nothing new to a lot of the topics that we talk about. But what's different here is that the same ideas play for what we observe. So what research has shown is that threat can be transferred, the response to threat. So we observe others and our reactions depend on theirs. We are social creatures. So our survival evolutionarily did depend on what we saw was happening to others in our group. So when we observe the environment to be one that has repercussions for speaking up or is punitive in this way, we show the same behaviors and engages the same areas of the brain. So that's really important here. And what it ultimately means is that, like, given that the behavioral outcomes of here, our saliency limbic circuit reaction is generally creating the behaviors lacking psychological safety, it suggests that at its core, this is due to an engagement of this circuitry. And why it's so hard to teach and to naturally fall into these behaviors is because of everything that we say all the time, that bad is stronger than good. We are much more reactive to threats and more sensitive and respond faster to threats than we are to rewards. So that's all interesting. We know kind of what psychological state lacking and our behaviors that we see in those environments stem from. But what's really interesting is a whole separate set of research. And this is not reward research. This is safety research, that we are also really sensitive to symbols or to stimuli that signal safety to us. And a lot of this, in this case, is social safety. So what this research has generally shown is that when we are in the presence of a safety signal, it engaged a whole other set of brain regions that are generally part of the prefrontal cortex, different regions here. And in the presence of them, and in observing others, it actually dampens the responses to pain and danger. So there's these amazing studies that show that in the presence of like a social symbol, essentially that symbolizes safety, that your feeling of pain dampens, social buffers. And so what you see in the presence of safety signals and observing others, it's the same kind of idea, is that you do see an increase in curiosity, in learning, and pro-social behavior, collaboration, all of the things that we would like to see in an environment of psychological safety. And so what's really powerful about this is this set of research told us so much of what we needed to know when we want to create an environment of psychological safety. That given that social signals can act as buffers in the presence of perceived work threats and perceived risk, we can use them to create a more balanced environment, a more productive environment in the presence of uncertainty. And so you can kind of create that balance, especially when work stakes are incredibly overwhelming. So, this kind of covers kind of the why we act the way we do in certain environments, how to create the environments that we want to create psychological safety. And now how we have to do that with others. So how do we do that? How has kind of NLI approached this situation?
Yeah, NLI, as you know, and have been a huge part of, has done a lot of thinking about psychological safety, and not just psychological safety. We have, this long history of developing our understanding around psychological safety. We've studied different pieces for quite some time. And along the way, we've created solutions that speak to different elements of psychological safety. And that's like, for example, we have voice, which really focuses on empowering people to speak up and collaborate. We have care, which is about developing those pro-social behaviors you had mentioned and supporting our colleagues. And last year, we partnered with Amy Edmondson to develop Team. And Team really is all about honing in on a skill set that can help foster psychologically safe interpersonal environments. And because leaders are such a critical part in psychological safety, really about role modeling the behaviors that we want to see. And leaders often kind of hold that outsized responsibility for the team environment. We're also seeing the value of embedding elements of psychological safety in our newest solution, which is LEAD. And that solution is actually currently in pilot. So it's super exciting, but I do want to tell everybody a little bit more about team and how we got to the solution. So as I mentioned, we partnered with Amy to develop team, and it's a great partnership. Amy is known for her decades of academic research on psychological safety in organizations. She is one of the most frequently cited researchers for psychological safety, and really made the concept famous with her groundbreaking research that built on, and in my mind, really brought to life the concept of psychological safety, which was actually first coined by Edgar Schein in 1965. And so in her work over these years, she's hearing this call for interventions that are more specific and actionable, not really just focus on assessing whether an organization has psych safety, but why or why not, and what people can do about it. And what we developed together really focuses on what can you do? And we came to 3 habits to create psychological safety. And so what you see here are the habits: set the stage, invite participation, and respond thoughtfully. And when these habits are when people engage in these habits, you see that people will collaborate and they will learn. And ultimately, this positively impacts the organization. And I will say, although team is relatively new, we're already learning a lot. And so I did want to talk a little bit about what we're learning. We consistently collect data to gauge people's experience and work to improve. And as I mentioned, it's a little early, but what we're seeing is higher than ever before averages for team from our participants. And so typically, those averages are about 4.4. So they're typically pretty high out of a 5-point scale. But for team, they're coming in at 4.7. And these scores are really just a general expression of a client's experience and how they feel about engaging with the content and the delivery of the solution. And overall, what we're seeing is people are really enjoying the team learning experience. And this is based on, a set of global organizations. One thing, though, that we're also seeing, right, is that, as you mentioned, this is hard. So we're seeing lots of positive behavior change, and people are letting us know that one of the more difficult behaviors to engage in is really this idea of sharing mistakes. And so we've been having conversations with clients about how to make it easier for people to share mistakes. And this is so important because we know that mistakes are a key source of learning. And what we're finding, and we've mentioned this a little bit throughout, is that a key component for making it easier is role modeling. And that role modeling really needs to come from leaders. Leaders have the outsized responsibility for creating this psychologically safe environment because of those inherent power differentials. And that means if you're a leader and you want to encourage people to share mistakes, you might have to be the first to do it. And that's important because it's critical to understand everybody's watching. So you talked about the observation. So it's not just the idea that I shared a mistake, but I'm also watching how people interact when Emma shares a mistake. And that's giving me information. And it's not enough to really talk about psychological safety. Leaders really need to engage in those behaviors that the science is showing us create psychological safety. And Emma, we're doing a lot of work in the realm of psychological safety. And you've been doing so much recently with research on leaders and leadership. And I'm kind of wondering, like, as you're going through this, what do you see coming up next?
Yeah. And actually before I get into that, because we're getting so many questions, I
Sure.
feel like we need to answer some of these questions. So there's one that actually stems a bit off of, and this is from Tara, off of what you were just saying, but
Yeah.
how can you create a sense of psychological safety in an organization in which micromanagement permeates from levels over which we might not have control? So
Mm-hmm.
from above. Yeah. How do you
This
think
is,
about that?
yeah, this is such a great question. So although leaders have an outsized responsibility for creating and role modeling, anyone can do it. And it's important that everyone kind of engages in it. So for me, I think really having the bravery and courage to say, hey, we're not able to do our best work together if we already have all the answers, right? And really starting to ask questions is a great place to start. How can we get everyone's ideas on the table and make sure that we are getting feedback and we're able to share ideas and concerns? And to me, that is a piece of not micromanaging, because you need more than one person's idea. So sometimes I feel like the micromanaging piece comes from, hey, we already know the answer, right? And there's some pieces of that we already know the answer that kind of makes sense. But in general, having a more flexible and agile way to ask questions and engage with each other leads to better performance. I'm also wondering what kind of comes up for you.
Um, yeah, we've talked about the micromanaging. I know I've been thinking about that as we've been working in like development of lead, and actually I was reading another question as you were talking, but I do think that the micromanaging piece does there is a lot of onus on leaders and the behavior that leaders have to work on developing their own skills around that and trying out experimenting with different ways to interact with their team members and to provide them with a bit more autonomy, and maybe at the same time, find different ways that you can still gain some control while allowing those team members have autonomy. And I think and I do think that, and maybe that also brings in a bit of the accountability piece that we'll be discussing next week, because if you, and I think that it works both ways, if you're not able to see the accountability in your team, then maybe you might be more likely to micromanage. And it definitely differs depending on whether you are a new manager or a manager that's had a lot of experience. And we find that as new managers, micromanagement is one of the tendencies that, coming from a place where they were able to do all of the tasks themselves and they knew how to get there, and then to pass that on to their team is very difficult.
Yeah.
But, what's coming up is, and we talked about this yesterday a bit, about the relationship between inclusion and team, or inclusion and psychological safety. And so Anne's asking about team. It leverages SCARF. We didn't really mention that, but yes, it does leverage SCARF as one of our primary models in it. But how is that different between how we use SCARF for inclusion, and how do those interact? We sometimes do talk about, using both, and there are pathways that people can take go through include, and then maybe go on to team. But how are they the same and different?
Yeah. And this is such a good question, and it makes a lot of sense to think about, how do these different things complement each other? So for me, when I think about psychological safety, I really do think about like the environment and the atmosphere. So really, how do we create conditions to help amplify things like inclusion and growth mindset? And I think if you have that environment of psychological safety, inclusion and a growth mindset will be better able to flourish. And in the end, that'll feed it back into the environment and create even the stronger atmosphere of psychological safety. So I think they really all work together. And I kind of think about psychological safety as creating the environment for other more individual behaviors to flourish.
Yeah, yeah, agreed. I mean, there's so much that, which is one of the reasons why it is so hard, and it takes a lot to not only share mistakes but also come together as a team. I mean, one really important step as groups are going through team, as we found, or just creating the environment, let's say, is first is just understanding that you're all working on this together and you have a shared goal. Like that, happens before anyone can really speak up and share a mistake. You first have to understand that you're all part of the same group, and there are these norms that you're all expected to share, and you all have these same roles, and you're all important for the shared goal of the team. And then maybe you can feel encouraged to interact and to speak up. And then the other step is then having a disagreement. We did have a great question in the chat about retaliation. And this was coming from Yvonne. What about retaliation in the case of psychological safety? Have you thought about that?
Yeah, so retaliation is a part of the definition, which would make it counter to psychological safety. So if there is a sense of fear of retaliation, then I would say it's an indicator that that there is low psychological safety. And the difficulty here is when there is the work stakes are high and psychological safety is low, the outcomes are impacted. Performance is impacted, and people's well-being is negatively impacted. So yes, definitely, if there is fear of retaliation, it is a indicator that fostering psychological safety is needed and is important.
Yeah, absolutely. We're getting a lot of comments about the whiteboard example from the very beginning and how that was such a good example. Or, from Patricia, that the whiteboard example is a great one as an artifact to create psychological safety, right? I mean, it provides an avenue for people to see what you're thinking and share,
Yes.
making it easy. Maybe if someone doesn't have the right words to say, or
Yes.
let's show in the same place what we're thinking. In your understanding and in the writings that Amy has done, providing different examples, what other, let's say, artifacts or systems have people used that enable psychological safety?
Sure. So for me, what I think about is really like, how do we learn together? And part of learning together is being able to map out ideas. So I don't have a specific answer about artifacts, but I do start to think about how do we collaborate together and how do we make sure people are part of the co-creation process, that it is like you mentioned, we're in it together. It is not mine, it is ours. And so to me, it can be kind of difficult in a virtual environment when you're not able to get together to create, but it is not impossible. It just has to be intentional. And as you also told us, when we were thinking about why doesn't this come naturally to us, psychological safety is all about intentionality anyway. You really are fighting against your default to hold back. And so you need an environment where you are able to jump in, and that you're expected to jump in. And so to me, some of the artifacts would be What activities have we done to hear multiple voices? What are the common ways we seek information from each other? What are the different forms of feedback that can really help people engage? So for me, I tend to be a longer processor. And so in the moment feedback is often difficult for me. I have to process it, and I need time to kind of think about it and get my thoughts together before I feel like I can provide meaningful and valuable feedback. So if I'm only attending meetings where there's in the moment feedback, to me, you're kind of missing out on what others might have to offer. And so to me, that's a part of an artifact of learning. Those aren't very specific examples, but I think get at that idea of learning and sharing information as being important.
Yeah, that's those are all great examples, and I think part of that is understanding what works best for the team. I mean, so that's part of the process of understanding the social norms of the team is what is going to work best when we share ideas, and how many different ways and systems can we put in place to make sure it's easy for everyone to share ideas and have these debates. You know, one thing that's coming up in our question box from Lisa is a great one, and something that you know, I've been thinking a bit about is just this idea of, you know, is it possible for, you know, we've been thinking about how employees should feel safe to speak up, but what about in the other direction? Supervisors feeling safe to be candid and provide feedback with employees. And there's nothing new about this. It's absolutely, maybe we don't think about it, but it is just as hard for supervisors to share that they're making a mistake. I mean, they are coming in at a power differential, and their view of how their team responds to them and views them is important. And so sharing that you might have made a mistake, or even providing feedback to those employees is a potential threat. And so we, you know, that could be, if we're thinking about the SCARF model, is, you know, a potential status threat. Like, how are they going to view me if I made a mistake? So it absolutely works both ways. But sometimes the onus is greater on the manager or the supervisor to set the stage for them.
Yeah. And I think that is partly how are mistakes handled. And so one thing that I love is that, you know, we work together a lot, is that when we find mistakes, it's almost celebrated in the sense of like, hey, we're doing good quality assurance work here. We're finding our own mistakes in our team before it goes outside of our team. That's awesome. And now we can revise our processes instead of like, who messed this up? What's happening? And so I love the learning environment, even on our own team, which is great, of like, yeah, okay, good. Who found that mistake? That's awesome. How did you find it? How can we do more of this? And the same thing, like when mistakes are maybe found outside of our team, we're really receptive to that feedback. It is not always easy feedback. And at the same time, I think, you know, pulling in some of the other neuroscience pieces of it, of reframing and understanding our kind of emotional ties to the work we do, is helpful in those situations as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we're kind of leading, going down the road towards accountability. And I have one more question from Bruce. The idea, and I think this brings growth mindset into the discussion too, but is labeling of mistakes an issue or an opportunity? And the way I view it is it should be viewed as an opportunity. And I think that if you also at the same time instill this sense of a growth mindset, you will view mistakes as an opportunity to learn from. And that's a pinnacle piece of having a growth mindset as opposed to a fixed mindset, and being able to share that mistake as, because it is a common behavior, you know, I made a mistake, this is what I can learn from it, you know, and I think it's a critical part of psychological safety. It's what we teach in a growth mindset, and it also brings in the idea of accountability.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So we're getting a ton of great questions here, and you know, keep keep them coming. But I think, this kind of leads into, what we're thinking about, in the future, and, what kind of tangents have stemmed from trying to understand psychological safety. A lot of what we've already worked on has been in creating different aspects of psychological safety. So in voice, we've talked a lot about, how to allow people to feel safe to speak up. Include is how to feel people, like how to include others in the conversation. All of these are different pieces of psychological safety. And something that's come up a lot, and maybe stemming from the environment of the last few years of people working from home more often and things like that, is the idea of accountability. That shift in now how do I make sure my team is accountable, and trying to understand what that even means. We have a lot of employers saying we want our people to be more accountable, but what does that mean, especially if maybe you're not being accountable to them? And so understanding how you create that and how to change the definition from one that is maybe more punitive to one that's more like growth oriented, that those kinds of questions are questions that we're asking now, and will lead into what we'll talk about next week. So we will have that as well.
And one thing on accountability, just that we've, it is kind of, we're exploring this area a little bit, but one thing I think is interesting, especially when you're thinking about this interpersonal environment, like how we interact with each other, and the idea of group norms, as you mentioned, like what's going to work for our team for sharing information? What's going to work for our team for reframing mistakes? So a part of that to me is also saying, if this is something we want to do, how do we hold ourselves and others accountable to engage this behavior? And I always think back to a story that my dad told me about. He coached volleyball for a long time. About a key component of his coaching and team building was having these the norms written down, but going through a process that if you're writing something down, like our team will interact this way, you cannot write it down unless you also have kind of like an accountability piece to it. When someone is not doing this, when I am not doing this, this is what we'll do to remind ourselves what we are looking for. And I think that's an equal part of what we're trying to dig into. Like, what are the things that remind us what we're in it for and what we need to do, what we mean to do, but sometimes forget in the rush of work. So I think that's also an important part of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And thinking about the like group dynamic nature, I know you and I have a little bit of an accountability partnership with walking during the day.
Yeah.
It does keep us doing it. And I think that brings in like the team nature of psychological safety. I mean, in kind of holding each other accountable to creating this environment. Accountability is a social thing. I mean, you might have, responsibility towards your own tasks, but when someone is watching and that you're like, everyone is watching each other's behaviors, that changes whether or not you'll engage in that behavior. So yeah, anyways, I know we could go down this road. I don't take from those that are talking about accountability. I know it's really interesting next week, but I would say the one last thing that I wanted to ask you is we have been talking a ton about how difficult this is. This is a difficult environment to create. It takes time. Even those that have been diving into team are finding where they're having challenges and what they have to continue to work on. So if you were to tell any of us here who really think that this is necessary, where do you even start?
Yeah, right. That always reminds me of the pictures of people, about to climb a ladder, and whether the first rung is low or the first rung is out of reach, right? And so sometimes the first rung feels out of reach. So what I like to think about when I'm thinking about psychological safety is what can I do to normalize candid, learning-oriented conversations at work? What can I do to remind myself that this isn't about comfort? It really is about embracing discomfort. It's about embracing not knowing everything. It's about embracing the idea that together we're able to solve something that one person alone couldn't do. And that's a challenge. And it's not always an easy challenge, but it's an energizing challenge. The other thing I would say is that really, no matter your role in an organization, whether it is an individual contributor or a manager or an executive leader, one place to start is asking a question. And it's not any question. It's one that is really this genuine invitation for someone to provide their thinking, their perspective, their ideas. It's a question that is driven by curiosity and your own desire to learn. And with that kind of question, you can immediately lower interpersonal threat. You're inviting people to talk with you, to figure things out, to engage with you. And so I think that's always where the first best place is with a good question. And just talking about lowering interpersonal threat, and as you discussed earlier with SCARF, the SCARF model is really one of our main tools for understanding threat and reward. And Emma, you actually were talking about it during last week's episode and launched the updated assessment. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, we are incredibly excited about this, and we're excited about what we're going to learn from it. It is one of our favorite models. It forms the core of so many of what we teach, so many things that I put into my everyday life for myself, and as I communicate with others, it is an incredible tool to kind of guide how we interact. And it's also really interesting to understand about ourselves. So we have kind of dove back into the assessment. We're looking at, what to really gain from this. What we have here is just a QR code, and I know Evan has dropped in the link the a way to access the new assessment again. And I know anyone who was here last week, you might have taken it, but I would actually suggest maybe even taking it again, because we do think that it does change by context. Maybe after this conversation, like maybe you're driven by, different things, or maybe based on the fact that it's, a different Friday and you have other things going on, that you might see some slight differences. So we're looking to get information from you all too. It's going to help us answer other questions, and you'll see, what we learned from you all as well. So it's really exciting. I hope you'll take it. I know this has been such a great conversation.
Yes.
And we've had way too many questions to even answer them all. But always feel free to reach out if you have other questions. Any last thoughts from you, Bridget?
No, I really enjoyed this conversation. I love talking about psychological safety. I think it is such an important aspect of work and doing our work well. I challenge us all to really think about how can we foster that learning environment at work, and try to make it happen in some way, shape, or form.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think I'll pass it back over to you, Shelby, and hope you all had a great time. It was great chatting, and have a great weekend.
Thank you, everybody.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Emma and Bridget, for today's discussion. And personally, from my experience at NLI, you both make it very psychologically safe. So we appreciate you. Now closing, let us know how NLI can help you with this poll. And I'm going to share a few more announcements. So if you missed Summit this year, we do still have our on-demand pass where you can get access to panels and conversations. So we'll share that link. Also, if you enjoyed this conversation, we do have our podcasts. So where Your Brain at Work, wherever you listen to podcasts, you can find new episodes, and we will be updating those regularly. And really, this is where we officially say farewell. So on behalf of our team behind the scenes and everyone at NLI, we appreciate you, and we hope you have a wonderful weekend. We'll see you next week.